Thank you very much. I'd like to introduce Executive Director Michael Lord from the Maryland Public Ethics Commission, and he is going to be giving us a presentation on the Maryland State Ethics Law. So I'm going to turn it over to him now. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephanie, and good morning, everybody. I appreciate the opportunity to be here with you. Let's talk about ethics. The issues we're going to discuss today, well, first of all, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the law, why we have it, what its purpose is, and what it covers. We're then going to talk about the conflict of interest provisions, and that's really what this is primarily about. So that'll be the focus of most of this hour. I'll talk very briefly about financial disclosure. Can I have a show of hands? How many of you actually file financial disclosure statements with us? Just a couple. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, but I'll take questions if you have them. And then available resources. There's a slide on available resources where you can go to get help and guidance. Okay, so why do we have a law? I should go back, even though the slide doesn't do this, and tell you that we've had an ethics law since 1979. It grew out of the Watergate era. Those of you that have studied history, even if you didn't live through it, are probably familiar with that incident in our history. And it was that incident plus other things that kind of caused people in this country to have some question about government in general and whether people in government were really there to serve the people, put us there, to pay our salaries, or whether people were there largely for their own self-interest. And it was that, and as I said, other incidents as well that gave rise in 1978 to the Federal Ethics in Government Act, which applies standards and governs federal employees. Most states followed suit, and in 1979, the General Assembly passed, and it was signed into law, the Maryland Public Ethics Law, which is what we're going to talk about today. So we've had a law for 38 years. Why do we have a law? Well, one reason is to tell us what the rules of the game are. While we all kind of have generalized ethical ideas of what's right, what's wrong, the law was intended to tell us exactly what we should and shouldn't do as public employees here in the state of Maryland. And it does that, and I'm going to talk about that. It also is intended to assure the citizenry that when we make decisions in our official capacities, that we're doing that not in our own self-interest, but we're doing it for the benefit of the people we serve. And it was intended to assure the citizenry by having a set of rules that when we abide by them, that in fact we're doing what we're supposed to do with the best interests of the public at heart. And it requires officials and employees to disclose certain information about themselves. Those of you that raised your hand that you file financial disclosure statements know that there's certain financial information that you provide. That information is publicly available. And the idea there is that the public will know when we make decisions whether we're doing it for our own financial benefit or whether we're doing it for reasons having to do with the best interests of the people in the state. So the Ethics Commission, what is this commission? It's an entity consisting of 5 individuals. All 5 are appointed by the governor. 2 of those 5 are nominated to the governor, one by the Speaker of the House, one by the President of the Senate, and but all 5 are ultimately appointed by the governor. And their job is to implement, interpret, apply the ethics law. What do? Well, a number of things. They basically provide advice, which is probably the function that we are engaged in most frequently. People call, subject to the law, asking how the law applies in a particular set of circumstances. Over the course of its 38 years, the Commission has actually issued some 500 what we call advisory opinions. These are written opinions. You can find them on our website, and they indicate how the Commission has interpreted this law over the course of its 38 years of existence. More frequently now, the Commission renders what we call informal advice. You contact us at the staff level, and if it's a question we can answer on our own at the staff level, we'll do so. If it's a question that has to go to the Commission, we'll take it to the Commission. But instead of publishing that advice in a public way, the advice is rendered generally by letter or in some other type of, maybe by email or depending on the formality required, it could even be a phone call. But we'll provide advice to you that's directly from the Commission to you without being published the way these some 500 opinions have been over the years. As I said, that's the way people tend to prefer to get their advice nowadays. That's the way we generally render it. The commission regulates lobbyists. Most people don't know that. There are some roughly 700 lobbyists in the state of Maryland, and for the privilege of being able to be lobbyists, the law defines, by the way, what a lobbyist is, but if individuals are engaged in conduct that defines them as a lobbyist, they're obliged to register with us, and they're obliged to submit reports for all the clients that they represent on a semi-annual basis. And the idea, and those reports are available on our website for the public to see. The idea is that lobbying is a fine profession. It actually provides a lot of information to people making decisions in the legislative or legislative or executive branches of government. And it's a perfectly appropriate way to convey information to make sure decisions are made properly. But if people are going to lobby, the feeling is that the public has a right to know who's doing the lobbying, who they're representing, what issues they're lobbying on, what kind of money is being spent. In other words, how much are these lobbyists being paid by their employer to lobby for them? What kind of functions are these employers sponsoring in terms of receptions and so forth, all of which is appropriate, provided the right steps are followed. But in any event, we regulate lobbyists with the Ethics Commission. And as I said, there's about 700. Well, and this is not the last thing, but of the things I want to highlight today, the other thing the Commission does is it undertakes enforcement action. Despite our efforts to provide training, as we're doing today, and despite our efforts to put the word out and the help we get from the various state agencies, occasionally somebody runs afoul of the ethics law. When that happens, we're obliged to take enforcement action. We have a portion of my 12-person office that is engaged in the enforcement part of what we do. And that involves doing investigations, looking into complaints, and then the Commission ultimately making a decision as to whether there's been a violation or not. So that last bullet indicates, we have a 12-person staff counting me. I'm very proud of my staff. If you call our office, I promise you, you'll get an answer to your question. You may not always like the answer, but you'll get the answer. And if we don't have somebody there to answer it, we'll find somebody who can. Occasionally we get calls from people who call us because they're not happy with somebody's job performance. The public will call and say, you know, I called this office. I've been calling them every week with this problem I'm having, and they're not answering me. They're not getting back to me. They're not returning my calls, or they're not basically dealing with the issue the way I think they should. That's unethical. Well, it's a problem, but it may not be unethical. Ethics is particularly as the ethics law in the state is defined, it doesn't involve job performance. And so we tell people that's not really an issue under the ethics law, but we do our best to try to find them the right person to talk to. And that's the beauty of our staff. And we try not to leave people hanging. We can't help everybody, but we do our best to put them on the right track. Okay, so our focus today for the bulk of the time is going to be conflicts of interest. And the way we're going to do this is through these scenarios that will hopefully flesh out the law. I always try when I give these presentations to make the scenario somewhat relevant to the particular audience. Sometimes I get it pretty close. Sometimes people look and say, that would never happen here. But hopefully the way this plays out, it will help illustrate how the law applies in various situations. And I find this is a pretty useful tool for trying to explain how the law works. So looking at that first one, let's say you're part of a team and you're reviewing software for possible purchase by UMB. The idea would be the software would be used to evaluate professors in their job. And there are a number of companies that have proposed or submitted bids on this, and among them are a company that employs your sister-in-law and your daughter. Do you think you can follow through with this assignment and be part of the team evaluating this under those circumstances? Anybody think you can? We have some yeses. Okay, well, here's what the law says. The law says that you cannot, this is, you look at the top, the heading is participation. This is the participation restriction in the ethics law. The law says you and I can't participate in any matters where we or certain of our relatives have an interest in whatever that particular matter is. The relatives that the law specifically targets, if you will, are parent, spouse, child, siblings. It's those relatives, that if they have an interest in the particular issue that you're being involved in, then there's a restriction on your ability to participate. Or if you have an interest. Looking at that second bullet, you also can't participate in matters where perhaps some employer, perhaps you have a second job or you have a financial interest, through some ownership of a company. If a company that employs you or where you have an interest has an interest in the particular issue that you're considering, or a company that employs one of these relatives, again, it's very specific, parent, spouse, child, sibling. If it involves an employer of one of those people, then you can't participate. The law refers to these relatives, by the way, as qualifying relatives. Those are the ones to be concerned about. So interestingly enough, it doesn't apply to your cousin or your grandmother or your aunt or your uncle. It's very specific in that regard. I'm going to go back to the scenario for a second. Let's say that so looking at this now, can we all agree that because your daughter is employed by one of the bidders, which is parent, spouse, child, sibling, a qualifying relative, you shouldn't be participating? So let's take your daughter out of the mix. Let's say that she's not involved. It's just a business that employs your sister-in-law. Can you participate now? Okay, we are focused here very specifically on the participation restriction. Sister-in-law is not a qualifying relative, and so, yes, you can participate under the participation provision. There's another provision in a little bit I'm going to talk about called the prestige of office restriction that may have some bearing here. And I might add this. The fact that you can participate may not mean you want to participate. I'm just telling you where the bar is set under the ethics law. If you've got an upcoming holiday dinner and your sister-in-law is going to be there with your brother, and you've just been part of a team that denied her company this bid, you may not want to have to sit across from her at the dinner table. So the fact of the matter is you may not want it anyway. You may not be comfortable. It could be your best friend, your next-door neighbor, any of those people that aren't covered by the participation restriction are people, though, that you may want to think about recusing yourself or not participating in because there might be a comfort issue. But the point I want to make here is that's a decision you'll have to make. The participation restriction wouldn't touch the circumstance where the only person involved is your company that employs your sister-in-law. Let me ask you this, staying on this theme. So we've still got your daughter out of the mix. We're talking about a company that employs your sister-in-law. Or actually, let's bring your daughter into the mix. Let's move your sister-in-law out for a second. So it's a company that employs your daughter. You can't participate. So let's say there's about 8 companies that have bid on this project, and you say, well, I've learned the ethics law now. I just talked to that guy from the Ethics Commission. He came and talked to us. I know that I can't be involved in the discussions involving the company that employs my daughter. But there's 7 other bidders as well, so I think I'll sit in on those other 7. I'll recuse myself when they talk about the one, but I'll be engaged in the rest of them because I don't have a problem there under the participation restrictions. What do you think? Does that sound okay? I see some heads shaking, and you're right. You really got to sit out the transaction, don't you? Because remember that a big part of what this is all about is the public needs to be confident that we make decisions, we're making them for the right reasons. And you could sit out the discussion of the company that employs your daughter, but you could also still affect the outcome by being incredibly critical on those other 6 or so that you sit in on, pointing out every flaw, doing your best to make sure that your colleagues who are helping you make the decision see all the problems in all these other entities, with the result that the contract still goes to the company that employs your daughter, at least in theory. So yes, you sit out the transaction. That makes sense, and it's obvious that you're all well aware of that's the way you should handle it. So let's take a look at this previous scenario again. We got this company bidding that employs your sister. A company that employs your daughter. And you can see that I kind of messed up the slide. It should have stayed with daughter all the way through. So bear with me. This is what happens when you carry slides through. So the company employs your daughter. They're one of the bidders on this company. And the daughter works in California on a contract in California for a company that's national in scope. In other words, your daughter's involved, has an interest in her company has an interest in the outcome, but she's not at all engaged with the business with the state of Maryland, with UMB. She is out there in California working in the California school system, and therefore will never touch this particular contract involving if it's awarded to her company. Do you think it's okay now? Can you participate? Well, I see some questions, some doubt, and that's good because, again, if you go back to the law, there's nothing in the law that says that that it doesn't apply in the scenario we just talked about. It still applies because an entity, the company that employs your daughter, has an interest in the outcome. There's nothing in that law that you're looking at on the screen that suggests that it's conditioned on the relative having some involvement in the contract. So the answer is no, now you still can't participate. But I should add at this point, there are provisions for exceptions, and I'll talk about that in a second. In some of these scenarios, they're not cut and dry, absolutely not. There are situations where you can come to the commission for an exception. We'll talk about that in a second. Let's say you're assigned another scenario here to a panel to interview candidates for a vacant vice president position. So you're part of the team, the search committee. You're going to sit down and interview these candidates. Your brother's one of the applicants. We all know the answer to this now, right? Can you participate in that process? No. And can you sit out the interview with your brother and be involved in the interviews and the decision with the other 9 candidates? The answer is no. Okay. Now, there are exceptions, as I said, to these participation restrictions. One of them is and I'm not going to spend time on the first 3 because the first one in particular, number 1 under that first bullet, has to do when you're serving on a board or a commission, so it isn't likely to apply to you. And those other 2, 1, 2, and 3, really aren't going to come up in your everyday life. But the second bullet, permitted by state ethics commission regulation, does come up from time to time. We have regulations that the commission has adopted at the direction of, per the ethics law that says our commission can grant exceptions to the participation restriction in certain circumstances. When would that be? Well, let's go back to your daughter who's working out in California for the same company, but working on projects or contracts with the California state school system, not in Maryland, not anywhere near you geographically. Well, the commission looks at those factors, looks to see who the relative is. For instance, in its 38 years of history, when there's been a request submitted to the commission to grant a participation exception, the commission has never granted an exception when the individual that's the source of the conflict is a spouse. Relationship's too close, too tight, presumably, you're going to look at your spouse every night, and it's hard to convince the public that you're acting impartially. But a daughter, a sibling, a daughter's a little tough, but the geographic issue being in California helps a lot. And so it's a kind of looking at all these issues collectively, and under the regs, the commission can grant an exception. I should add one thing. We don't get a lot of requests for participation exceptions. The next matter under the law that I'm going to spend some time on, we do get a lot of requests for exceptions, but not this one. Why? Usually if you're part of a team making a decision to award a contract, the easiest thing is you just recuse yourself and somebody else gets appointed. Very simple. If your job has you involved in some sort of engagement that relates to a company that hires one of your employees, or actually one of your relatives, often you can pass that responsibility on to a colleague or to a superior, and it seems like that's the way these get resolved. It's not often that somebody says, I have to participate in that issue, that particular matter. And it's very important that I be involved in awarding this contract. And it may be a case that you bring certain expertise to the discussion. And in any event, depending on the circumstances, you can come to the commission for an exception. And the commission has been known over the years to occasionally grant them. Okay, changing gears here. Your spouse is part owner of a construction company that was recently named the prime contractor for the construction of a new academic building at the university. Does that give anybody pause? Your spouse is not you, but it's your spouse is a part owner of a company. Well, here's the issue. Now we've changed gears. We're not talking about participation anymore. We're talking about what's called employment or financial interest. And here's what the law says. Absent an exception, and lots of people come to our commission for exceptions in this respect, but absent an exception, an official or employee may not be employed by or have a financial interest in an entity that does business with their agency, in your case, the university. Or an entity that is negotiating or has entered into a contract with the particular entity, in this case, the university. So you can't have a financial interest in any business that's doing business with your agency, any interest that is negotiated or is regulated by your agency. Now, I know you don't do a lot of regulatory work here at the university, but there are contractual relationships that exist. And now you're thinking to yourself, well, that's my spouse, it's not me. I'll explain that in a second. But let's get to the or part, because there's a third way. These two are pretty, stay on this one for a second. There's two pretty easy to determine circumstances when you're trying to analyze whether you have a concern here or not. You can figure out by asking people, perhaps in the case of regulatory work, I suspect, again, you don't do a lot of regulation, if any. But some agencies do. And they can find out, people in those agencies can find out, well, who do we regulate? And you can black and white make a decision whether there's a business relationship of some sort or an employment relationship with an entity that you regulate. You can determine that second bullet pretty easily. Go to the procurement office, find out who the agency contracts with, and you can figure out if you have some sort of, if you're employed by or have a financial interest in one of those entities. But this next one's a little different. It also says, in addition to those two, this says you can't hold any other employment that would impair your impartiality or independence of judgment in doing your job. I'm going to give you a quick example of how that might apply, and you're going to see that this one really does require some analysis. The first two, you can seek out the answers pretty easily. But let's say you worked, instead of here, you work for a member of the General Assembly, say a senator or a delegate. And you do the typical things that you do as a member of a staff. You take calls from constituents. You might cover some hearings. You might help draft legislation. Typical things that a staffer does. And it also so happens that you happen to have some background or knowledge in the area of bookkeeping. And a lobbying firm that does a lot of business in Annapolis finds out about your experience in some way and comes to you and says, we need a bookkeeper. We don't need a lot of time out of that bookkeeper, but a couple hours a week, or somebody needs to come in the evenings would be fine, and just straighten our books out, keep track of them. We'll pay you well. You get some extra money and work after hours, and won't conflict with your job. And you say to yourself, what a great opportunity. And because you've had the ethics training, you say, and I know that the General Assembly where I work doesn't regulate lobbyists or do business with lobbyists in the contractual sense. You know that the Ethics Commission regulates lobbyists. So you think you're clear on those first two bullets that we just talked about. But let's say then now you're in your job, you've taken this second job with this lobbying firm, and you get a call someday, and the firm says, somebody on the other line says, hey, we need to get an appointment with your boss, like quickly. There's been this legislation introduced. It's really a problem for many of our clients. Can you get us in? And you say, well, my boss is really busy. Lots going on. I can get you in, though, this afternoon at 1 o'clock if you can get over here. Of course, they're happy, and they come over, and so on. A few hours later, another lobbying firm calls that you have no relationship with and says something similar. We've got to get in and talk to your boss about this bill that was introduced. It's important. It causes problems for our clients. Can we meet with your boss? And you say, well, yeah, I'm looking at the calendar, and I can get you in a week from Friday. So what happened here? What happened here was that you treated two entities differently. Your impartiality was impaired by your being hired by this lobbying firm. In other words, you treated them differently. And you might think, well, how am I going to know that? Well, that's where you have to say, well, I work for the General Assembly. We deal with lobbyists all the time. If I take a job part-time with this lobbying firm, is it going to cause me at some point to have to make a choice, or kind of possibly to treat them a little differently? Because the law is intended to make sure that we treat everybody the same, and that's how it's intended to work. I think what I would want you to take away is that everything we talk about, the participation provision, this provision, and the ones we're going to talk about, keep in mind that the idea behind all of this is that the law is intended to ensure that when we do our jobs, that we're doing them with the notion that the state's interest comes first, not some outside interest, not the interest of our family members, as we talked about in the last situation, not the interest of some employer or somewhere where we have a financial interest, not the interest of somebody who's giving us gifts. We're going to talk about gifts in a few minutes. It's the interest of the state that comes first, and anything that somehow is going to impact on that and cause you to perhaps show some favoritism and not put the interests of the state and the public we serve first is, you should immediately think could be a problem. Okay, now remember, the issue here, going back to the example, let's go back to the example here that your spouse being a part owner of a construction company, and you're saying to yourself, okay, well, that's my spouse, it's not me. But the law defines financial interest. Remember, you can't have a financial interest in an entity that does business with or is regulated by your agency. The law defines financial interest to include three things. First of all, ownership of more than 3% of a business by you or your spouse. In other words, the law attributes, in this case, your spouse's interest to you. Makes sense. Obviously, if your spouse has a financial interest in that entity and you have some dealings with that particular entity, it could be problematic. So that's issue number one. Also, if it's a publicly traded company and they issue securities, stock, and your spouse or you own at least 3% of those securities, then again, that would be a financial interest. The last one's a little different, and basically, I'll simplify it. If you own stock or have some interest in an entity that today, and we'll stay with stock, if you were to sell your shares and you could obtain more than $1,000 for those shares, you have an interest, financial interest in that entity. Now, that one is a little different, and notice that third bullet doesn't talk about your spouse's interest. Only the first two attribute your spouse's interest to you. Now, we get exception requests a lot, and the issue in a case like this would have to do with whether or not in your job, because, university systems, UMB is a big entity. And so the fact that your spouse has an interest in a company that has a contract building an academic building may very well not touch on you at all. Your job may be completely different. You may be a professor, a department head. You don't have anything to do with a contractual relationship. And it's that type of thing the commission will look at to determine if, in fact, you're an appropriate person for an exception. It becomes more problematic if you're the person involved in the negotiation and implementing the contract with the entity where your spouse or you has an interest, as you can understand. But the agencies that we tend to deal with, for the most part, are pretty large, and in most cases, the person who has a conflict initially doesn't have the situation where they're engaged in the relationship. And if that's the case, our commission is very likely to grant an exception. So let's say this. You participated in the development of a proposal for funding of a major laboratory renovations at the university. Okay? So you helped develop the proposal, the contract's awarded, and one of the companies, obviously, that bid on the proposal, or on the proposal, or submitted a proposal, was actually awarded the contract. Contract's awarded, work proceeds. You're invited by this particular contractor to come work for the contractor on the particular contract with the university. Can you do that? You're thinking, what's the problem? Well, one hint, with one or two exceptions, if the scenario appears up on that screen in front of you, you can presume there's probably a problem. So that's a little bit of inside information here, although there is one coming up that actually is kind of an outlier. But here's the problem. This is what we call the post-employment restriction. Everything we talked about thus far, and everything we're going to talk about after, involves you while you're employed by the state. This is the one provision that kind of follows you as you leave your state position, taps you on the shoulder and says, hey, wait a minute, there's this one other provision that actually impacts on you, and you need to take into account when you consider employment after you leave. It's called, not surprisingly, the post-employment restriction. So here's the problem. Well, let's talk about what the law says, first of all. It says a former employee or official may not assist or represent an entity for compensation. So you could take a job, if you want to call it that, with this contractor, as long as you didn't take any money from them, but most of us are inclined to want to make a living. So you can't be employed for compensation by an entity in a case, contract, or specific matter in which you significantly participated during the time of your state employment. The idea here is a couple things. It's intended to not allow people who have been working on one side of an issue in the interest of the state and kind of walk out the door across the street and take their knowledge and their background and experience that they gleaned working on this particular matter and just kind of hand it over to the contractor. And the other thing is, I think it's intended, remember that we want the public to believe when we're making decisions, awarding contract, whatever we're doing, that we're doing it with the public's best interests. It doesn't look very good if you've been engaged in developing the specifications of the contract or sitting as part of an evaluation team that awards the contract, and then it just so happens that the successful bidder hires you. I mean, there's an appearance there that maybe you used your position for your interests, and so the idea is the law is not going to let you do that. Again, you have to have significantly participated in it, and it's specifically linked to a case or a contract or some other type of specific matter. That's important. People say to me a lot, okay, well, there's probably just a cooling off period, right? I wait a year, then I can go do it. No, there is no limit time-wise to this. If this was a contract awarded over the course of 10 years, then you're precluded for the life of that contract from going to work on that contract for that particular employer. On the other hand, it's very narrow. It's tied not to the employer, but it's tied to the particular matter or contract you worked on. So this same employer could offer you employment and basically put you to work on some other project that they're engaged in that doesn't have to do with the one you worked on, and you can take that job. So occasionally people say, man, this is like shackles to the state. I can't go work on projects in the area that I'm familiar with. If you work for the State Highway Administration or you work for the Maryland Transportation Authority or somewhere where you're working with contractors or dealing with bids on roads and bridges, you're not precluded from working on road projects or bridge projects. You're precluded from working on projects where you significantly participated. I should add this. People will say all the time, what is significant participation? Well, it's case by case. We need to evaluate what that is. And we encourage people to come to us when they have this post-employment possibility. The higher up you are, the less it takes to be significant. If we'll have people at fairly high levels in an agency say, well, yeah, this proposal came through. I approved to go ahead with this. I initialed it, but the people that did all the hard work were below me in the chain of command. I didn't sit down and study it. Well, if your signature was important or required to move the project forward, that's significant participation. So what that is and how that applies is something that you ought to come to us when you do, or if you do have a situation where there's a post-employment question. But keep that in mind, that it's important to think about these things even after you leave the state. But it's not as limiting as you may think. I think in this regard, the General Assembly got it right in terms of developing a balance between not requiring people to be handcuffed to state employment forever, but on the other hand, making sure that they don't somehow or other create the appearance that they've worked with these contractors in order to feather their own nests. Okay, let's say a CEO of a company that does business with the university and happens to be a friend invites you to be his guest in his box at the stadium to watch a Ravens game. Okay, you think you can accept that invitation? Friend. Must be a lot of Ravens fans because nobody wants to say no, but I happen to be a Patriots fan, and so I wouldn't have that question anyway. But here's the issue. Can you accept the ticket to the game to get into his box? Can you enjoy the food and the drink that he's going to provide for you? Okay, well, let's talk about it. We have a yes. Okay, we're going to talk about another scenario, and then we'll get into the law. Okay, let's say instead of this friend who's the CEO, you're invited to lunch by a lobbyist and say that this lobbyist lobbies on higher education issues, say issues that would affect the university. So the lobbyist says, hey, how about coming to lunch? I'll pay. Can you accept? We have a yes. Okay. Let's say instead of lunch or in addition to lunch, the lobbyist pulls out this neat logo jacket that you'd love to wear. Can you accept the logo jacket? We have a no. Okay, well, here's what we have here. This is what we call the gift law. Keep in mind, remember I said earlier that the idea is when we make decisions, we don't want to be affected by our personal interest, or in this case, by somebody kind of lavishing some sort of nice present on us. We want to make decisions for the right reasons. And again, appearances are important as well. The law says this, first of all, no solicitation. So you can't solicit a gift, period, in your position as a state employee. So if there happens to be some contractor that does business and you happen to be the liaison to the contractor, you say, well, I know you have a corporate credit card, you have plenty of money, let's go to lunch, and how about if you pay? Well, you're using your position to solicit a gift. You should never solicit, doesn't matter who don't solicit a gift in your official capacity. Can you ask your brother-in-law on a weekend to pick up the tab for lunch because you've picked it up the last 12 times? Sure. We're talking about regulating your conduct as a state employee. The law also says, and we're going to focus on the exceptions that follow, that second bullet, you cannot take unsolicited gifts. And we're presuming in these scenarios we just talked about they were unsolicited. They came to you without you seeking them out. And it's only certain categories of donors that you have to worry about, but these are the ones. Vendors, so a company that does business with your agency, or in this case with UMB, would be one category. That's that CEO of that company that has a contract with the university. That's a vendor. You can't accept a gift from them. If you regulate it, lots of agencies regulate various activity in the state. You can't take a gift from entities that are regulated by your agency. You can't take a gift from individuals who lobby on matters that are relevant to your agency. Lobbyists lobby on all sorts of matters, and if you have lobbyists that don't deal at all with education issues and other things, they may be fine. It's lobbyists that lobby on matters pertinent to the particular agency that you're from. Finally, you can't take gifts from anybody who has a financial interest that could be uniquely affected by some sort of decision you make. I'll give you an example. Let's say you work for the Department of Natural Resources instead of for UMB. And you come in every day, and one of your jobs is to review permit applications for whatever, various activities. And you come in, there's always a stack of permits. You go through them, or applications, and approve them if appropriate, or deny them. One day you come in, pull out your permit applications, and you notice on your desk this great big fruit basket, courtesy of somebody whose permit application happens to be sitting in your in-basket. Well, that would be somebody who has an interest uniquely affected by a decision you're about to make. You can't accept that fruit basket. So we call, the commission staff, you won't find it in the law, but our term for these four categories of givers are controlled donors. They're the ones that if somebody's offering you a gift and they fall into one of those categories, you should call us and talk to us about it. But there should definitely be a red light that goes on when you get something from them. There are certain exceptions. A nominal gift you can take from these people. And when we say exceptions, we're talking about exceptions from these particular types of donors, the controlled donors. You can take a gift that's under $20 in value. So you can take a ball cap, a pen, maybe a little binder, something like that. You can accept that kind of gift, under $20. You can accept meals and beverages in the presence of the donor. Now, people often kind of conflate the meals and beverage exception with the nominal $20 exception. There is not a $20 limit for meals and beverages. So if somebody invites you to lunch and picks up the tab, you don't have to steer them to McDonald's or Subway. Nothing wrong with those places, but you can go to a more extravagant lunch is not limited to $20. There's a reasonable element. And if this particular person invited you to this wonderful dinner and started ordering, $400 bottles of wine, it might be a little unreasonable. But the typical event is fine. And also, if you happen to be somebody that goes and provides lectures or gets invited to be a speaker at a conference, and the entity putting on the conference is somebody that does business with or has some relationship with the university, well, you can go, and you can accept food, lodging, travel expenses, reasonable, for your participation, as long as you have a role on the agenda. If you're a speaker, if you're part of a panel, those types of things, you can actually let them pay your way to go present, and that's an exception right in the law. Now, you could not go in January, I would suggest, to some sort of a seminar or some sort of conference in Honolulu, be a speaker on day one, and allow the sponsor to continue to pay your way for the next 5 days so that you don't have to rush home to cold Maryland. It's got to be reasonable. We realize to get to Honolulu, there's some time to get out there, time to get back, but you have to be reasonable. And so you could accept the travel, the lodging that was reasonable for purposes of the time that you're engaged in the conference. If you want to stay longer, because it's a great conference, you can, but you or your agency would have to pick up the expenses that get you to that get you to the end of the conference. But let's go back to this example. Let's go back to the first one. So the CEO of a company that does business with the university and wants to invite you to be his guest and hands you a ticket to the Ravens game to get into his box. That didn't appear on those exceptions we just talked about, and it won't. And it's because sporting event tickets are not allowed. Now, having said that, I do want to draw a quick distinction. Well, let me stay with this, and then I'll draw a little distinction. Once upon a time, way back, there was an exception in the law under certain circumstances for sporting event tickets that were allowable. The General Assembly literally removed that, I say at least 15 years ago, removed that from the law, making the point that sporting event tickets are never acceptable, no matter who you are. Unless, you're part of the University of Maryland system, and there might be tickets floating around to go see Maryland play football or basketball, for instance, or go to see UMBC or some other school play a sporting event. If the source of the ticket is the university or the system, somebody, in other words, another government or state entity, well, that's not a gift from an outsider. That's fine. But let's say that Maryland has a great basketball year. They're in the Final Four, and a lobbyist gets you a ticket to the Maryland basketball game. The source is important here. The source is no longer the state. The source is no longer the university. The source is this lobbyist. That takes us back to a controlled donor. So you can't take this ticket, going back to the example, to get into the box at the Ravens game. But you can buy your own ticket. You can pay your way. And you can enjoy the food and the beverages. Why? Because there's another exception that covers this, meals and beverages in the presence of the donor. Well, I'm presuming the CEO is going to be there. He's the donor. And so that would cover your ability to at least enjoy the party part of it. You just got to pay your own way in. Now, why is there an exception for meals and beverages in the presence of the donor? My guess is, I wasn't there in 1979 when the law was enacted, but is because there was a recognition that sometimes business gets transacted over a meal. Some entity that is regulated or does business with an agency might be holding an event or a luncheon, and there's a cost associated with it, but they're prepared to give you a gratis invitation or whatever, and there might be some educational component. In other words, business can be transacted, and the General Assembly, I suspect, didn't want to put the clamps on reasonable opportunities to conduct business. So that's where the meals and beverage exception in the presence of the donor comes in. Again, in the presence of the donor. If the person meets with you because you happen to be the outreach person on a particular contract, and the contractor says, hey, thanks for taking an hour with me to discuss the complexities of this contract. And as a thank you, I would like to extend an invitation to have you take your family to Ruth's Chris tonight for a great dinner on us. I'll call them. We have an account with them. And just tell them you're coming. Take your family and have a wonderful dinner. Well, you're not in the presence of the donor anymore. And so that exception does not apply. And there's a difference, and you can kind of understand that. Same thing with this one. You're invited to lunch by a lobbyist. You can have lunch with the lobbyist. The lobbyist can pick up the tab, and it's all well and good because you're in the presence of the donor. Now, the presumption in this example was that the logo jacket is worth more than $20 because you got to look at that exception category to decide whether you can accept the jacket. Remember, nominal gifts, yes, over $20, it doesn't become nominal anymore. One other thing, for those of you that do financial disclosure statements, you don't have to report gifts you receive that are $20 or less, nominal gifts. But if somebody takes you to lunch and the cost of that lunch is clearly, $40, when you do your statement, while it was okay to accept the lunch, you have to report it. You have to report gifts you receive from these types of donors that we're talking about. Some you can't take, and the ones that you can take, if they're over $20, you have to report them. So, okay, your best friend's son has applied for a position at the university. Your friend asks you to put in a good word for for his son with the officials doing the hiring. Can you do that? I'm not suggesting you're being asked to just be a reference where at the bottom of the resume or the bottom of the application where 3 references are listed, your name is one. This is a request for you to get on the phone and kind of help the son along because you have a relationship with the hiring authority. You think you can do that? Okay. Well, this often causes a little confusion. You mean I can't be a reference? Yes, you can. And people ask me to be a reference a lot. People ask me occasionally to write letters for them, which I will do. But as you'll see, there's a difference between this situation where you've used your position, presumably, and your familiarity or relationship with the hiring officials to try to impact the outcome. This is called the prestige of office restriction, which I said I would mention and apply it back to a scenario we talked about previously. But here's what the law says. You can't use your position for your private gain or that of another. In other words, you can't take the influence that comes with your holding the position you hold to somehow impact some outcome for your benefit or somebody else's. You also can't use your position or the resources that are available to your position for your private gain. For instance, if you happen to be, let's say I'm a realtor on the side. Let's say on the weekends at nights I sell real estate, and it's perfectly fine. Let's say there's no conflict with my first job because it doesn't really interact with the ethics work at all. But I let it start creeping into my day job, and I start sending emails while I'm sitting at my desk to clients or other realtors. I make copies of flyers on the office copy machine. I schedule appointments, have phone conversations that have nothing to do with what I'm doing for the state, and I'm using my state time, my resource of the state. My time is part of the resources of the state, and I'm using it for my private gain. That's a no-no. That's unacceptable. Now, I said before that I've written letters of recommendation, and the commission long ago recognized that life goes on, and there's got to be some realistic ways in which you can still do certain functions without impacting or getting cross-threaded with the prestige of office restriction. We have lots of interns who come to work for us, and I serve as a reference for them if they ask. I used to work for the Attorney General, and over the years I've gotten to know attorneys, and sometimes they apply to be judges, and they need letters written for them, and if it's somebody that's deserving of a letter and I get asked, I'll write a letter. But I take that letter home. I don't write it at the office. I don't use official stationery of the Ethics Commission. I make my own letterhead, and I started out with saying, "Dear so-and-so, I write this letter as the I'm the executive director of the State Ethics Commission," because they got to have some context. They got to know how I know somebody or what I do or where I'm coming from. But I write this letter in my personal capacity, and the views expressed do not reflect the views of the State Ethics Commission. And then I go in and say how I know the person. And if it's somebody who worked for us as an intern, I'll say that. Where the commission has recognized that, reality is you ought to be able to say some good words, but you want to make sure you divorce your words from some sort of official position. I also said I would relate this back to an earlier scenario where I think the scenario was something like a company that employed your sister-in-law was a bidder on a contract, and remember we decided, well, that's not a qualifying relative, although you may not want to sit across the holiday table from that person if you've been part of a group that denied her company a contract. Well, the prestige of office provision also has some application. It's very subjective. It has to be analyzed, so it's not cut and dry and black and white like participating in a matter where your sister or your spouse or your parent has an interest. This is one where you got to look. So if you're part of a team reviewing contract proposals, including one from a company that employs your sister-in-law, the question might be, well, how did he or she act in the discussion? Did she really push hard for the company that employed her sister-in-law and treat everybody else differently, showing incredible favoritism on the others, on the hand, or in the case of the sister-in-law's company? And so, again, subjective, but this is how you can get cross-wired with the law by that prestige of office restriction. And my point is only, here's another reason where there's a relationship with somebody, whether it's a neighbor, a best friend, somebody that's not specifically covered by the participation restriction, you still might want to stay out of the discussions for a lot of reasons. I'm going to skip past this only to note that starting on October 1st of this year, the General Assembly, besides these very general requirements under the prestige of office, outlined a couple different specific activities that now violate the prestige of office restriction. I think they would have been covered anyway under the more general analysis, but in order to make sure that I guess these activities don't occur, the General Assembly has specifically outlawed them, if you will, under the prestige of office restriction. A couple have to do with campaign contributions, soliciting people to hire a lobbyist, or awarding trying to influence the award of a contract to some particular entity. That's using your position. And so, as I said, I think the general provision, which has always been in the law, would have applied, but the General Assembly decided to be more specific in these three areas. Okay, let's say the university is considering developing an RFP to purchase certain education software for university-wide use. Okay, now this is something that's been discussed, but not yet made publicly available because it's still being fine-tuned and lots of decisions still need to be made. But you think to yourself, well, my brother-in-law, has this company, and it sounds like this is something, his company, and he might want to bid on. And even though it's not been released to the public yet, you decide to let him know what's going on so he can kind of start getting his ducks in order and preparing for this particular opportunity to submit a bid. You see a problem with this? Yes, we all do. This is the confidential information restriction. It says, interestingly enough and not surprisingly, you can't use or disclose confidential information. What's confidential information? Information you've acquired by reason of your position that has not yet been made available to the public. You can't use or disclose this information if it's confidential for your personal economic benefit or the personal economic benefit of another. Makes sense. So the old insider trading rules. You can't be using information that's not out there yet because giving somebody a chance to get a jump on something or just giving them information that's not been generally made available, it's problematic. It goes back to providing favorites and or showing favoritism, and it's not allowed. So we've talked about the basic provisions of the law, the participation restrictions, the outside employment / financial interest restrictions, the post-employment restriction, the gift provision, the prestige of office restriction, and now the confidential information provision. Those are the basics of conflicts of interest. Those are the things that you need to worry about in your everyday conduct. And I encourage you to call us if you have questions. I am not going to dwell on financial disclosure. We're about at the close of the presentation. This does go into them in some detail. I'll just suffice to say this. If you're a financial disclosure filer, you probably know that you have an initial obligation to file a financial disclosure statement within 6 months of assuming the position that is tied to your position. If your position has been identified as a filing position, Within 6 months of taking that position, you have an obligation to file. Every year thereafter that you hold that position, you have an obligation by April 30th to file an annual statement. And by the way, when you file, you're always looking back to the prior calendar year. So for instance, 2017 is about to draw to a close. So those of you that are filers know that somewhere between January 1st and April 30th, you need to submit your 2017 statement covering what just transpired in 2017. And then you have an obligation every year thereafter till you leave state service. When you leave state service, you have one final obligation, which people sometimes forget, and they go out the door, and then we try to find them. It's called a termination statement. So, for instance, if I left my job today, and I filed my 2016 statement as it was required somewhere between January 1st of 2017 and April 30th, I leave today, the law says I have one more obligation within 60 days, which is to file a statement that covers the period that has elapsed since the period covered by my last statement. In other words, January 1st of 2017 to today. And we all have that obligation. And then you're free and clear in the Ethics Commission. You can forget about us, except for that post-employment restriction, which will track you out the door. So skipping past this, the last thing I want to talk about is, well, I should tell you that your financial disclosure statements are public. They can be accessed if public comes to our office to access them. Starting on January 1st, 2019, certain filings by elected officials and agency heads are going to become not just public, as they already are, but available on the internet. Somebody is actually going to be able to log into our website and access those financial disclosure statements that are filed subsequent to January 1st, 2019. Unless you're holding one of those elected positions, you don't have to worry about it. The same rules continue. That people have to come to our office. The other thing I wanted to mention is home addresses. Starting on January 1st, 2019, we're obliged to redact home address information from statements that are filed for everybody, not just the folks who have their statements published online. So that will happen next year. You'll have to disclose it, but you want to tell us that this is my home address so we can be sure to take the steps to redact it. And things to do regarding your financial disclosure statement: request to be notified if somebody reviews your file. The law allows you to make that indication on your filing, and we will be sure to notify you if somebody actually does review your statement. And if you should attach any documents, make sure you don't attach personal information, Social Security numbers, account numbers if it's some sort of financial statement. Finally, the available resources. Again, busy slide intended only to tell you we've got a very robust website. And people, just last week, I was asked to do a little local radio interview, and the interviewer, throwing me a softball, said, "Can you give the listeners the website for the State Ethics Commission?" I said, "I have no idea." I said, "Google Maryland State Ethics Commission, and you'll get our website." But there is the address. But if you Google us, we'll pop right up. And there's a lot of information there for employees and officials, which covers you all, including memos on various topics we've talked about. The Commission has published these informational memos over the course of its existence that tries to lay out how it's analyzed different issues: gift law, outside employment, post-employment. And it's a good starting point, but I would never discourage you from contacting us. Always call us if you have a question. That's how you get a hold of us. Give us a ring. And once again, in case you do better than me and like to keep track of web addresses or URLs, there it is. But Google us, and you'll find what you need. With that, I'll take any questions. I'm at the end of my time, and if somebody wants to just chat with me afterwards, I'm happy to do that as well. Okay, well, I hope I have a question.
I did have one question. In regard to the $20 gift limit, is there a limit to the number of $20 gifts that can be given by a controlled donor to an individual?
Great question. Yes, it can't exceed $100 cumulative in the course of a year. So if somebody, being a bit shrewd, decided to start handing you $19.99 gifts, for whatever reason, and you thought that was great, and you had an inkling to receive these nice $19.99 gifts, you also have to consider the total over the course. We call it a reporting period, which is the financial disclosure reporting period, which is a calendar year. If you do receive gifts from any one donor, besides those that exceed $20, if it's a series of gifts over $100, you've got to report them. But, of course, you're not supposed to be taking more than $100 from any particular donor. Yeah, great question. Anybody else? Okay, well, I'm happy to chat with you afterwards. Thank you for your attention, and thanks for your interest, and call us anytime. As I said, I have a wonderful staff, and we're here to help you. Take care.